Hello and welcome to the Hail Mary GPP podcast. I'm Big Italy 42. He is Josh Shepardson at Chad 50. Talking about some of your favorite GPP plays for this weekend. And obviously, there's some chalk plays and there's some non-chalk plays. Nothing quite like Charkandrick West and Devontae Freeman to some extent last week. So we can lament as much as we want about West and Freeman getting hurt. They were in all of my lineups, but they were also in most of your lineups too, and probably most of everyone else's lineups. So we kind of all died together, and those who faded him, you got lucky. But either way, on to this week. Blake Bortles and the Jacksonville Jaguars facing off against the team that we keep making fun of defensively every single week, the San Diego Chargers, who they did a decent job at slowing down Alex Smith last week, but let's take that with a grain of salt because it's Alex Smith and he slows himself down by not making an effort to have big games. So the numbers there, kind of misleading. Obviously, Jacksonville, pass first attack. You got the two-headed Allen monster. Plenty of good targets. You got Julius Thomas is healthy now. Plenty to go around in a pass first attack against a bad defense. And Jacksonville, somehow, due to the fact that everyone else in the AFC South is equally terrible, they're still in the playoff hunt here, and San Diego's playing to, I guess their best bet is to try to play themselves out of that number one draft pick. They're awful right now in every way.
Yeah, and I mean, Bortles has a nice ceiling. He's still rough around the edges, but from a fantasy perspective, guy's got 20 touchdown passes. He's averaging almost 250 yards passing per game, adding 21 yards on the ground, which I feel like is a very underappreciated part of his game. I mean, that's 2 fantasy points. That's 2 fantasy points with his legs that he's getting you on a weekly basis. And the thing that I like about Bortles this week the most is the fact that everybody's talking TJ Yeldon, and this feels very similar to last week's Raiders situation where everybody was on Derek Carr, Michael Crabtree, Amari Cooper, and I advocated in the GPP article on the podcast last week that Latavius Murray was a nice contrarian switch from that. Did Murray put in a big game? No, he had about 8 points, but his touchdown was enough to really outproduce basically the rest of his teammates that were in there. You did see him featured on the FanDuel Million winning roster, so we didn't sink that roster. This is the same situation. Obviously, you hope Bortles doesn't just go out and throw 1 touchdown and manage to outperform Yeldon just based on that. But point being, everybody and their brother is going to be on Yeldon because of the obvious matchup and the weakness of the Chargers against the run. They are the most giving defense to running backs this year. I love TJ Yeldon this week. Not a shot at TJ Yeldon, but if you want to be different, if you want to be contrarian in GPPs, you're grabbing Blake Bortles, getting exposure to that nice, juicy 25.25 Vegas total with Bortles, and not doing so with Yeldon because you're going to get Bortles at a lower ownership. You're still getting a high ceiling. You're still getting exposure to a bad defense and to that big, juicy point total. And again, it shouldn't be overlooked that's been a pass-happy Jaguars team. Yes, they've gotten Yeldon some rushing attempts, but they've attempted more than 100 more passes for the season than running attempts.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said, I mean, we've seen them score lots of points in a hurry as well. So Blake Bortles can be as inefficient as he wants, but if he gets those 3 touchdowns and 300 yards, you don't care if it's on 19 of 42 passing. Points are points. You're not a Jaguars fan. You're a fantasy points fan. So maybe you're a Jaguars fan. If so, sorry. That's unfortunate for you. But either way, speaking of unfortunate fans, Cleveland Browns, now Josh McCown back under center. And as much hate as people think I just spew at Johnny Manziel blindly, I'll give him credit. He was playing better, but the guy needs to grow up. That's always been his biggest issue, aside from his size, which you can't fix. But, I mean, you go out and you say, maybe that's an old video, maybe it's not. I mean, don't be an idiot. Like, you're in the spotlight, you're old enough, you're a grown man, just don't be stupid. But from a fantasy perspective, I'm thrilled to see Josh McCown back because his best game of the year came against the same Ravens team. And while you mentioned here, Brian Hoyer, my personal favorite quarterback, it's going to be a very chalky play, of course, but that's not necessarily the type of play that's going to win you a tournament. That's the type of play that you fill in, and you got to hit your other parts because a lot of people are going to have Brian Hoyer, but a lot of people are not going to have Josh McCown. And, I mean, against a Ravens team that's literally an actual shell of their former selves on offense and defense, I mean, Josh McCown has all the potential to have a big game here.
Yeah, and I mean, he's the same minimum salary at DraftKings as Hoyer, which I think plays into his hands in terms of low ownership. He's also $800 cheaper than Hoyer on FanDuel, and That doesn't seem like a huge margin, but $800 can certainly bump up another position quite nicely. And if he plays at the exact same level as Brian Hoyer, or $800 cheaper on FanDuel, you're gaining an edge just based on the salary alone. And as much as I love Hoyer, and I love Hoyer this week, it's impossible not to like him. He should be your cash game quarterback. He should be on a number of your GPP rosters. If McCown plays at a similar level, you're getting edge on FanDuel and you're not losing anything on DraftKings. And I love McCown's low ownership. I love the fact that he had his best game of the year against this Ravens team. And it's not like the Ravens are a good defense either. I mean, they're giving up a ton of fantasy points. They rank as a top 5 giving fantasy defense to quarterbacks on FanDuel, and they've given up the second most fantasy points, trailing only those Saints that are playing Brian Hoyer this week to quarterbacks on DraftKings. So I really like McCown a lot this week.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. I'm on board with that play. And then next up, kind of the default elite running back, because not that he's not an elite running back, but you've got guys like Jamal Charles, Le'Veon Bell, all these guys on the IR now, and out for the season. Marshawn Lynch out for the foreseeable future. But, I mean, Pete Carroll likes to lie to us about his status anyway, so who really knows what his situation is. Adrian Peterson now in a matchup against Atlanta that, they're not a terrible defense. They're not a great defense. They're almost the exact average defense. And Adrian Peterson, is going to get a big workload. Last week, the Packers knew it was coming, but the Packers have known it was coming before with Peterson and not stopped him. But did get in the end zone, so still had that nice floor. And we saw a 200-yard rushing game a week ago, and he's been one of the more consistent guys. But I guess based on name alone, people just expect Peterson to go out and put up 25 fantasy points each week, and if not, then they're mad. So, the recency bias to some extent kind of just keeps his ownership low. And this is a week where most people are paying down at running back. So going with a guy like Peterson can be a nice way to set yourself apart.
Yeah, and I mean, Peterson's going to draw some ownership just based on name value. He's a name brand. He's leading the league in rushing. You're going to see people that just plug him in based on that. I mean, anybody that's leading the league in any offensive categories, they're going to get some ownership bump just from people clicking, sorting, and grabbing the top option at each position based on their previous production. He's the only running back averaging over 100 yards per game, though, and I mean, that speaks to his ceiling. He's been the best running back in football this year, at least among the healthy backs. Again, you pointed out some guys that are down for the year that could have, laid claim to that if they were still healthy. They're not. The Falcons, from a fantasy perspective, have been very giving to running backs this year. They're allowing the third most DraftKings fantasy points per game to running backs and the fourth most FanDuel fantasy points per game to them. You don't have to worry about sloppy playing conditions that'll make it hard for him to run. They're indoors. They're in Atlanta. He's going to be able to, rush at a high clip on a perfectly manicured field and against a bad defense. And he always gets volume, which is great. But he's not just volume dependent. He's averaging 4.8 yards per carry this year, which is huge, and he's still finding the end zone. He's not one of these backs that gets lifted for a goal line vulture. I'm looking at you, Jonathan Stewart. He's got 6 rushing touchdowns this year. He's tied for 4th in the league with those 6 touchdowns. He can basically do it all, and you point to the floor, which we don't usually look at in GPPs, but it's nice to have that in your back pocket, a guy with a high floor like this who also has that high ceiling. And the biggest thing is, as you said, people are going to be looking to pay down at running back. There are a lot of injury fill-ins at running back. There's Thomas Rawls coming off of a hot game filling in for Marshawn Lynch. TJ Yeldon with that juicy matchup with the Chargers. Buck Allen as the one-man show in Baltimore. Spencer Ware, and I mean, the list goes on, and it's a great position to spend down at so that you can spend up at receiver. You want to be a slightly contrarian in GPPs, grab Peterson, who probably still going to be 15 to 20% owned, but should probably be 30% owned based on his numbers this year in the matchup, and I just don't see that being the case.
Yeah, and another contrarian guy is the guy you got up next is Tevin Coleman, who, beginning of the season, the guy that I drafted heavily in season-long drafts, he was going to be the guy. Atlanta all thought he was going to be the guy, and there's still no one on earth that can really say that they were the ones that said Devontae Freeman's having this breakout year this year. So if you really did say that, I'd love to see it, not being facetious. I just knew no one who was on him. But either way, Tevin Coleman hasn't looked great when he's been on the field, but going to be the guy with Devontae Freeman officially listed as out for this week. Obviously, a guy who we're going to talk about here in a minute is going to be a big benefactor of that, but someone's got to run the ball, and while it's not quite a balanced attack, it's gotten a lot more to a balanced attack with a lot of rushes for the Atlanta backs, mostly Devontae Freeman, but Tevin Coleman, I mean, he's had some opportunities, and this is still a guy that they thought highly of to draft high in the draft. So, now's his time to kind of assert himself and prove that he belongs on this roster.
Yeah, and this Coleman pick is largely game theory and volume driven. He hasn't put up exciting professional numbers yet, just 3.9 yards per carry. But he did rush for over 2,000 yards in his final college season last year with Indiana. Averaged 7.5 yards per carry there, so he was ripping off big chunks of yards. Scored 15 touchdowns there. And the thing is he's facing a Minnesota defense that looks better. If you just look at the fantasy points allowed to running backs, then it really is. They're surrendering 4.3 yards per carry, which is one of the bottom 10 defenses in the league. They're tied for the ninth highest yards per carry allowed to runners this year. And while I usually avoid injury fill-ins, there are so many bargains at the position. I just don't see Coleman's ownership exceeding 5% this week. And anytime you can get a guy that's going to touch the ball probably 20 times at under 5% ownership, all it takes is one big play sprung for him to pay off his salary. And obviously the upside's greater than that if he's going to get that many touches. Last week, he had 18 carries in relief of Devontae Freeman. So I do not expect them to abandon the run just because Freeman, that's been their nature this year. They want to establish a balanced attack, like you said, and they want to keep things honest for Matt Ryan. And they really haven't had a running game in years that they could rely on to do that. But this year, they have done a much better job. And I think Coleman's volume plus the low ownership make him worth a dice roll in GPPs.
Yeah, and then speaking of a guy with some big-time upside over here in GPPs, Julio Jones, the guy that you don't love in cash games because it's not the best matchup. And also, a lot of what's held him back at times this year has been Matt Ryan's inconsistencies. But he does have monster upside. And without Devonta Freeman, I mean, we saw this last year. It was Julio Jones, Julio Jones, Julio Jones, and then a little bit more Julio Jones. Now with Devonta Freeman out of the picture, going to be, or at least for this week, going to be, a heavier dose of Julio Jones. And we saw Vontae Davis shadow him. Teams know it's coming, and you still are going to have a really tough time slowing down Julio Jones. He's one of the bigger receivers, one of the more athletic guys in the entire league. I mean, it doesn't matter if you know it's coming. You're not stopping it, and Minnesota doesn't have that one. They don't have a Darrelle Revis or a Josh Norman to throw at Julio Jones and say, okay, that's your job. Try to slow him down because you're not stopping him. You just hope you can slow him down.
Yeah, and I mean, this week, everybody and their brother is going to be on DeAndre Hopkins. They're priced very similarly on both FanDuel and DraftKings. Hopkins is the obvious cash games play. You're not moving off of him for Julio Jones, but this is a GPP podcast. This is your GPP play at receiver. He's probably going to be owned on half as many rosters as DeAndre Hopkins, yet this is the guy that's leading the league in receiving yards per game and receptions, and he's got a 10 reception edge over the second highest receiving total of the year, which belongs to Antonio Brown. So Jones has been a monster, and just think about the fact that he wasn't even 100% earlier in the year when he was posting some of his big games. He's on an absolute tear. He's totaled at least 137 receiving yards in each of his last 3 games. In that 3-game period, he has 31 receptions on 45 targets for 459 yards receiving and a touchdown. That's unheard. That's unreal. And the scary thing is while I think that the Falcons will continue to try to establish the run with Tevin Coleman this week, if he continues to underperform, they may be forced to air the ball out more, and that means more targets for Julio Jones. Is it possible that he could exceed his 15 target average of the last 3 weeks? I think it's certainly possible. I mean, it's not out of the question he could be targeted 20 times, and what Julio Jones could do on 20 targets is just mind-boggling to me. I mean, that's a ceiling that's worth grabbing.
Yeah, and that transitions us perfectly into the next guy who does have a ceiling.
Yep.
It's also worth grabbing. I mean, he's shown his ceiling this year as well. Antonio Brown. And I saw a tweet earlier, and I didn't look too much into it because I don't have the Thursday numbers, but saw a tweet that Martavis Bryant had higher ownership, at least in some Thursday contests. The only explanation I can see for that is, well, first of all, people are afraid of the Seahawks defense, which has not been nearly as good this year as it has been in years past, but also the fact that he's cheaper. And you want to be contrarian, people want to be contrarian for cheap, but that's the ultimate contrarian move, being contrarian and spending your money. And Antonio Brown, I mean, as far as pure talent-wise, I mean, he's easily a top 3 wide receiver in the game, and you'd be hard-pressed to see him at 5% owned this week, if that. at best.
And I mean, the thing is, he'll probably net some ownership because people are cognizant of the fact that he and Big Ben are just playing at an exceptionally high level. But that scare factor of the Legion of Boom is definitely going to drive that ownership rate down. His price is going to drive his ownership rate down. And I mean, there isn't a matchup that I'll take any corner over Antonio Brown in, and that includes Studley, Josh Norman, and others this year. He's averaging 151 yards receiving per game with Big Ben this year. 151. That's just, I don't even know what to say to that. This is a case of, you talk about teams knowing that Julio Jones is coming and not being able to stop it. Well, Antonio Brown is besting that total with Big Ben out there, and there's nothing you can do to stop him right now. He's averaging 114.1 yards receiving per game on the year, and that includes games with Michael Vick and Landry Jones under center. He has basically been an unstoppable force at receiver this year. His 5 touchdown grabs are, I don't want to say underwhelming, but not necessarily elite when compared to the top receivers. But all 5 of those came with Big Ben, and we know Big Ben missed some time. So when you look at it on a per-game basis, it's a little bit more impressive total. So I love Brown's ceiling this week. I love Brown's ceiling every week, and I think that you're going to get that at a lower ownership rate than he really deserves just because of that fear factor of facing the Legion of Boom defense at Seattle, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, I mean, it's all narratives there. People just buying or moving on based on the perceived tough matchup, but I haven't seen it in a while. I'm not buying the Seattle defense being great anymore. Travis Benjamin up next. We talked earlier about Josh McCown. We know the kind of rapport he's had with Gary Barnidge, but Travis Benjamin, a deep threat and a guy who's quietly been, I don't want to say one of the more consistent, but as far as cheap guys go, he's been fairly consistent all season, regardless of who's under center. So he is that deep threat. He does have that upside, and you don't know that Josh McCown has to throw the ball a ton to win this game, but he should, because that Browns defense is still so bad that Matt Schaub, Buck Allen, and company, I'll say, will still find a way to score points. So Travis Benjamin, definitely capable of making plays down the field, and he's going to be at a really, really low ownership this week.
And I mean, the Browns just haven't been able to establish the run at all this year. So even if the Ravens aren't able to muster offense, they may be forced to air it out just to keep possessions alive and to keep the clock moving and to keep the ball, because Isaiah Crowell, Duke Johnson, they just have not done squat as an offense running the ball, and that's played really into the hands of Josh McCown playing well this year. And as you noted, Barnidge is the guy that everybody's looking to with Josh McCown. Teams that do use Josh McCown and hook him with somebody, it's probably going to be Barnidge. And I think one really, really unique way to stack this week is going to be to go with Josh McCown and Travis Benjamin, because I would not be surprised to see both with a 5% or lower ownership rate. And I mean, the upside's big with them. He targeted Benjamin 11 times in that first meeting with the Ravens. Benjamin caught 6 passes for 83 yards receiving. Really strong showing, and that would be good enough for his salary at both sides. But, I mean, with 11 targets, another repeat of that target total would leave him more upside than he really provided in that first contest. The Ravens secondary has not been able to stop receivers this year. And even though Travis Benjamin, I think a lot of people associate his production with Johnny Manziel, broken plays, big plays downfield, yada, yada, yada. Benjamin's been good with McCown under center, and he's been targeted 10 or more times in 4 contests this year. That's value and volume, and you get value and volume together. That's a beautiful thing. I think the upside is probably slightly overlooked with Benjamin because he's still not really your household name at receiver. There are some other bargain plays at the position this week, but I really like Benjamin this week, and I will definitely be hooking him with Josh McCown GPP roster. I think that's a really unique combination this week.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And then last up, a guy that new role, but still the same talented guy we knew, basketball player converted to football player, Jimmy Graham, playing for a Seattle team that, you know, they focus on the run and they focus on the short passing game. And Jimmy Graham's been used a lot as a blocking tight end, but he certainly has that big upside that he always had. He's still a decent downfield threat. He's a great red zone threat. Still one of the best at any position in the entire game. And, you know, this is a Pittsburgh defense that overall has been pretty good, but has not been great against tight ends.
No, they've allowed 8 touchdown grabs in 10 games. I mean, that's almost a touchdown reception per game. Graham's touchdown production is down this year, just 2 touchdown grabs. But that's really a product of the fact that, as you said, this is a run first offense in Seattle. Graham still is one of the top pass catchers on his team. He ranks first on the team in targets. He has 44 receptions as well. He's second in receiving yards with 530, trailing only Doug Baldwin on his team. And I mean, relative to the position, he's still one of the better offensive players at tight end. There has been the emergence of some other guys like Gary Barnidge, Delaney Walker's playing very well. But Graham is still one of the better plays at the position. And I think the fact is people can't distance themselves from what Graham was doing before with the Saints and what he's doing now with Seattle, and it just continues to drive down his ownership when, in fact, now that his price is close and in the same ballpark as some of these other similarly talented tight ends, he's just not seeing the ownership because of that disappointment of him not producing like he did in years past. And I think he's going to have a really low ownership rate this week against a really soft defense against tight ends. And if they get in the red zone, I think it's a Jimmy Graham show. I'm expecting a touchdown grab from him this week. And the Seahawks have a surprisingly nice total this week at 24.75 points. Not a lot of big over-under totals for the teams this week. If you're hovering around 25 points, you're one of the higher totals this week. And that's the case for the Seahawks.
Yeah, and it's been kind of frustrating if you're one of those people that drafted Jimmy Graham or you play Jimmy Graham, but I mean, the upside and the potential is still there. It's just a matter of getting him involved. And with Marshawn Lynch out for the foreseeable future, maybe we see him get more involved. So I'm definitely with you there. Give these guys in some of your tournament lineups and follow us on Twitter at DF Cafe. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check out the rest of our great content at dailyfantasycafe.com.